whenever they want to talk about the history of Islam, usually what you see are pale skinned men. They usually ignore dark skinned men and they ignore females and their contributions into Islam itself. Now, the reason for this is obvious, but I will state it. The reason for it is because they want to sell this image of the dangerous Muslim and the victims who are always going to be black men and females. Now, firstly, I want to tell you that a lot of females in the Islamic world back then did things like mathematics, science, astrology, and stuff like that. And that was a not a common practice, but in around the people who did high levels of study, it wasn't rare, it wasn't out of the ordinary to see females, as a lot of them would be the daughters of very high people. These high people would in turn pay these other high people in order to figure out this information. And this information was so important that you would find females as far as Abyssinia coming to the Islamic areas to learn or to contribute to the society, not because they were slaves, not because they were anything like that, but because their information was valued by the society. Now, we could start by giving examples, but it's probably better to set the stage. First of all, if you watch a lot of documentaries, especially about Turkey, you will start to realize that the only time you see black people is two types. You're going to see black women who are guarding the harem of multiple pale skinned women, or you will see multiple black men who are eunuchs. And this is not in a very real way of portraying them. Now, Turkey, maybe they had a lot of eunuchs, but in other parts of Islam, it's not a real way of portraying the history of black people and Islam, especially considering the fact that black people had a bunch of children in the Islamic areas. And again, they were freed, and the majority, I'll say this again, the majority of slaves, if you want to go that direction, were females, and they would be freed within one generation, and their kids would not become slaves. That's why the Islamic trade was so heavy on fetching more slaves, because after one generation, they would free their slaves. Mentally, it wouldn't make sense to them to enslave the kid, your own kid. So, rising in ranks were these females who would end up, because let's quote the other passages in Islamic books where they say the general population did not have harems. If you understand that, the general population did not have harems, meaning that harems were things of the elite. Meaning, if you were freed as a black woman who started off as a slave, in which there were millions, some of them will become high-born scholars. We're talking about sampling from millions. Some of them would end up at the bottom. That is just a fact. A lot of them would end up at the bottom of society. They'd still be part of the society, but they would end up somewhere at the bottom, not as slaves, but as free people. Then you would have a large population that would end up somewhere in the middle, where they can just provide for their family, get married, and do stuff like that. That's a fact. And then the third one would be the ones that would remain elite with their kids, who are written about generation after generation. People like Al Jahiz, who their father is mentioned, and then he is mentioned, and then his son is mentioned. People like that are mentioned all over. And remember, Al Jahiz is one of those guys who wrote down many scientific things. He wrote about the atom, he wrote about evolution, he wrote about biology, he wrote about airs, meaning atmospheres or gases, he wrote about liquids, solids, he wrote about chemistry, he wrote about all kinds of things. If you ever have read his book, it's a giant thing, coming together of information. Some of it something he came up with, and then some of it him explaining other people's contributions into science. Now, for females, again, you get this idea like, oh, how many females are there? And if you ever see documentaries talking about females in Islam, you will always get this one word, astrolabe. Astrolabe is a woman who is thought to have used the astrolabe in order to guard the stars and stuff. And the astrolabe is a beautiful device, and I can understand why they talk about it. But what about Lubna of Cordoba, who was a mathematician and poet in the 10th century? Who, again, Lubna was born into slavery, raised in Medina in the palace, and then freed and became many things. She was first set to copy information. Then, because of her gift in numbers, she was then put into other higher things until she became a mathematician and a poet. She also wrote some stuff about her own life, but that has disappeared. Unfortunately, there are no pictures or exact depictions of what she looked like back then, but we do know that she was of African descent, emerging from the African continent. Now, I do not wish to brush over Astrolabe like she's some kind of person who doesn't matter, because she absolutely does. See, Astrolabe came from a family of people who manufactured these so called astrolabes, which these astrolabes were first developed by Greeks and Romans, and then they were improved by the Arabs. She manufactured a lot of, I'll say that again, manufactured, meaning she put in blood, sweat, and tears into making them. And so she's not just somebody who was using them. Like, she wasn't just sitting in the corner, like, get the men to build me an astrolabe so that I can use it. But she also did use them. She was aware of their use, and she was written about by several different people who contributed to the history of Islam. People like Ibn al Nadim or Saif al Dalwa and many other people. So we do know that not only did she exist, but she was very useful. And of course, there are stars. Well, the main belt, asteroid 7060 Al Alja, discovered by Henry E. Holt at Palomar Observatory in 1990, was named in her honor in 2016. Like I said, we do know, even scientists know, that her contributions to astronomy are huge. This is why her name is one of the first mentioned. But I think it is a disservice to only mention this one female as if there weren't literally thousands of females in Islam who are contributing to the science at the time, including black women. Oh, before we move on from the slavery part, I want to mention something. Not all slaves in Islam were working the field or some stuff like that. Some of them, without even being freed, their work in slavery was actually doing some intellectual work of some kind. So, in other words, it would be females who are in a harem, and then all that's happening to them is they're being educated to do stuff in their free time while they remain the main purpose being the wife of whoever the hell. But, a lot of the time they have a lot of free time. So they spend that time educating themselves in some of the greatest things, reading and stuff like that. Now, this is interesting considering the fact that in other parts of the world, reading for females was considered some kind of really bad thing for their brain or something like that, as Islam was back then, which again, that was for the elites. Divorce was still a thing. And we do find several females who, after their divorce, they marry someone else or they continue their life in riches because even though they're divorced, the person is still taking care of them. Now, someone that we do know who was divorced and continued to live a pretty good life and then was remarried again is someone called Zainab an Nafzawiya. Zainab an Nafzawiya was a very important woman in the history of Algeria. She, obviously, being from Algeria, was African, but not only that, she was known to have ruled or co ruled, being the only woman at the time to be called Malika. This word, Malika, meaning queen, is different than the word given to wives in Islam. So we know that she had some power. But not only that, we know that her power was not limited in just this one type of marriage because her husband died and she inherited the stuff of her husband and then she remarried. Lots of people wrote about her, like Ibn Khaldun and other people. And so we do know that her life was a pretty interesting one. Now, Zainab had a lot of things working for her in her advantage, and she was not afraid to use any of them to get ahead. One, she is reported to being a incredibly good-looking woman, and again, this is written that she took advantage of this. But not only that, she was a shrewd politician in the head, and so she was very witty and a lot of people actually liked her as a ruler, and so she played to her strengths. But not only that, she also, not being one to be put into one section, was into magic. And one of the things that she did was basically, I mean, in my opinion, magic tricks, but in the writings, she was doing magic and basically was seen as a good magician, if there's such a word, and doing things that could help people and stuff like that. Now, you do remember that I was saying that there used to be this thing of medicine women in North Africa. It was written by a lot of the Islamic scholars where they talked about two medical practices which they borrowed from, one being surgical practices and one being these potions from these North African women would be called wise women, which I wish I could play the video, but it's going to get copyrighted. It's on BBC. Look up the Islamic Golden Age on BBC. You'll find it, where they talk about these wise women who they say contributed immensely to the populations and the long jeopardy, and considering how healthy and how many things they invented to get rid of diseases that were getting rid of people by the millions in other places of the world. In fact, we know that a lot of the other medicines that they got came from deeper Africa, and then they spread throughout the Islamic world and then to China. One of these wise women, if you were to give a name, is Zainab al Awadiyah. Now, this Zainab is different than the Zainab I mentioned before, and there's still another Zainab called Zainab al Ashada, but I'll mention her later. Zainab al Awadiyah was a physician and a medical practitioner, and she was renowned in the Arab world due to her expertise in treating sore eyes and wounds. Zainab has been mentioned in different medical Arab books, in particular Kitab al Aghani, the Book of Songs, a major work of the 10th century historian Abu al Faraj al Isfahani. Zainab al Asha, on the other hand, was a polymath, a teacher, a calligrapher, all these other things that she did. Now, you're probably wondering why there's so many people called Zainab. Well, a couple reasons. One, because that was the name of the daughter of Muhammad. And then two, it's a name that has a meaning that was very popular back at the time. Obviously, that popularity has not died, as there are still women who are doing things that today we would consider pretty impressive, and they're still doing it. Now, we have to remember that some names like this are going to be very popular, but in the case of someone like Astrolabe, that's like a one of a kind type of name. And so, because of this, there's a lot of women whose names have blended over the years and been lost to the fact that they just become amalgamated into one person. Now, another side of the Islamic slave trade that is not told is that of black men who went and got slaves from all parts of the world. The reason why this part is not told is for, well, several reasons. One, because again, we have to look like the victims of everything. But secondly, they don't want to tell this because, of course, if they put these black people who, again, were elites in some cases in Islam, it would send a different message and also would make it seem like Arabs and black people were friends in history, which they were. I mean, I listed a bunch of females. Listing black people who made contributions in Islam would take probably hours, especially if I was to sit down and also list their achievements one by one. Africa had a giant pipeline from Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and all the other places, the Zanj regions. They had a giant pipeline that went into Arabia in the form of scholarship. And of course, Mali and places like that that were highly prized for their intellectual achievements. Now, why do we care about this? Why do we care that there was this type of scholarship? Well, think about it. This is black people and females only that I've mentioned so far. Black people and females. And there is so much written down about them. Now, the majority populations in these areas, the majority that are mentioned, were not necessarily black people and they were not necessarily females. And there's a lot of black people and females. So imagine how many scholars that are not mentioned in the mainstream, which are Islamic in general, meaning Persians, Indians, black people, just multiple, even people from Europe who ended up in the Islamic areas. Think about how many of them, and this history, by the way, is cut off. It's not part of real mainstream history taught in schools. So think about the different message it sends to human beings when you think about the fact that this area of scholarship, which is literally responsible for what had happened in Europe later after they had kind of abandoned scholarship for superstition. And then they were brought back by the Islamic Golden Age and the Ottomans and all these other people. Think about the scholarship that was happening at that time, branching all the way to China. I mean, think about the guy that, how many travelers do I have to show that these people were interested in the world just in general? I mean, the guy from Mogadishu that I showed that was written down by Ibn Battuta, and Ibn Battuta himself, again, another African writer. These are the words, and of course, I'm not going to like go against my own words here. Ibn Battuta is one of the biggest contributors in history. But the reason why we hear about him most of the time, none of these scientists, is to sort of send an image of, they traveled a bit, they did this a bit, when in actual fact, they were the legit scholars of the time. They were Einstein, they were Isaac Newton, they were all of these people before their time. And in fact, we find a lot of these same scholars who came up, especially in the Renaissance and times like that, literally quoting their names, Europeanizing their names, giving them European names. So someone who might be El Muhammad would be Al Mahmud or something like that. The names would be made especially for Europe. Why? Because there were translations. And the worst part is a lot of these books that I'm reading were translated by the scholars in Europe who wanted to know exactly what are these Muslims talking about? Why do they have such large books? And of course, there were some books that ended up in the files of Europe that came from Africa. Remember, I read you the book, the thing that was about the books from Mozambique. Remember, Mozambique, Kilwa, Mozambique, the Zant regions, they also had a ton of books that I showed you they were going to translate later in Europe that were taken by the people who first got there, the first European to get to Mozambique, literally took the books and sent them to Europe, showing a completely different culture than anything we ever thought, making it laughable to think that those people didn't have any real contributions. And of course, like I said, most of the people in East Africa, for some reason, I don't know why, the ones in the West, Southern West Africa, not West Africa, but the Southern West, like Angola and the Kingdom of Congo, didn't have contact, but most of the ones in East Africa had contact with Persians, Arabs, North Africans. And because of this, they had scholarship. And again, let's take this away from don't allow that to take away the fact that these were still African civilizations with African contributions and African poems, because they do this. This is a plot, this is a plan where they take away credit from black civilizations because there was like one guy who sort of contributed in those civilizations. I just showed you a bunch of females and black men who contributed in Islam. Does that take away from what they did in Arabia, what other Arabs did in Arabia? Does that take away from what people did in places as far as India or even China, where some of the black people would have ended up? Does that take any of that away? So why does it do it when it comes to Africa? They don't allow that to be a thing. Of course, we cannot leave out the fact that there were Moors, black Moors, by their hundreds of thousands in Spain, who we still have, grave sites where they dig up and they do DNA tests and they find these Moors who contribute heavily. Remember the painter that I showed you, who've contributed heavily to the history of Spain and Portugal and that general area in that region, and of course Italy, and of course even going as far as the Islamic world, because of course the Moors were attached to the Islamic world, not to mention North Africa, of course. But let's leave out the Moors for now because they deserve a video on their own. But let's go also to another one that was written down by Europeans, the Kingdom of Congo. The Kingdom of Congo literally took a bunch of people from Congo, free men, not slaves, and put them in the courts and the education systems of Europe, and these people literally contributed to Europe, and they brought back a lot of the contributions from Europe to Africa on purpose for the purposes of building schools and stuff in the Kingdom of Congo. And Kingdom of Congo started contributing heavily, writing back and forth and having schools be put in so that people can read the Bible for themselves. And so a lot of people in the Kingdom of Congo could read. We find this all over again. So these are just the small writings, the small interests of African civilizations. I haven't even mentioned Chad. I haven't even mentioned, Central Africa. I haven't even mentioned some of these other places that also took interest in writing and scholarship and stuff like that. Not to mention tribal people who had nothing to do with scholarship who still contributed stuff to the world. This is a painting of Dom Miguel in the Netherlands. He is painted, dressed up, the same as a Portuguese. There's also portraits of him and his friends, dressed up, not friends, but people who came to learn in Europe, who were also dressed in their traditional African attire. But that's a video for another day. And you can see that Dom Miguel here is painted very well. Now, some people have shown this picture and accidentally called it a Moor. He is not a Moor. He is from the Kingdom of Congo and was never referred to as a Moor at all. And I want to remind you, and I probably should do a whole video of the histories of the Kingdom of Congo from beginning to end. It'll probably be a 3 hour video, but you know, there's time for that. And I want to remind you that they worked with several different European powers. First with the Portuguese, then with the Dutch, also with several other states, Latin, no, Italian, and people like that, even with the Pope and stuff like that. We know that this happened. There's no speculation, there is no talk. They were sending letters back and forth with this civilization.